So, good boundaries are about taking responsibility for yourself and acknowledging the fact that God has made you as an individual being, and that I am not you, you are not me. And that, like we talked about in last episode, we have a responsibility to take ownership of our choices and our lives and not to do that for other people's lives. We'll talk more in this episode about what that means and what that doesn't mean. But I think that's a helpful starting point when we think about, okay, how do I go about setting boundaries with my friends? Maybe anything you want to kind of like recap from our last episode on boundaries before we dive in?
Yeah, I'm a simple guy. If you set a boundary and you require someone else to do that boundary for you, that's a bad
Yes.
boundary. A good boundary requires you to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. Or at least you're defining what am I going to do in this given situation. So I think this is helpful. We referenced this book a couple times. I'll read another quote from it. This is from Henry Cloud's book titled Boundaries. He says this. He talks about the distinction in Galatians 6:2 between responsibility to or responsibility for. He says this: we are responsible to others and for ourselves. Carry each other's burdens, says Galatians 6:2, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. This verse shows our responsibility to one another. Many times others have burdens that are too big to bear. They do not have enough strength, resources, or knowledge to carry the load, and they need help. Denying ourselves to do for others what they cannot do for themselves is showing the sacrificial love of Christ. This is what Christ did for us. He did what we could not do for ourselves. He saved us. This is being responsible too. On the other hand, Galatians 6:5 says that each one should carry their own load. Everyone has responsibilities that only he or she can carry. These things are our own particular load that we need to take daily responsibility for and work out. No one can do certain things for us. We have to take ownership of certain aspects of life that are our own load. So, responsible to others and for ourselves. And what we're saying, healthy boundaries are about taking responsibility for yourself, not taking responsibility for someone else. Any comments on that before we move on?
I agree with that 100%. I think from a world, what the world tells you, it's all about you, and everyone should do what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. I want you to call me this. I want you to, anytime I walk into the place, here's how I want it. Like set, like it serves them, and I don't think that's called prideful people there. So it's like that's not it. That's not a biblical view. And anything that we do should glorify the Lord. So
maybe one caveat I want to make about boundaries. We kind of mentioned this in the last episode, but before we walk through specifically helpful kind of framework for thinking about how do I set boundaries with my friends, I think we need to make it clear that boundaries are not going to solve your problems. Boundaries can help solve your problems, but just making rules and saying, I'm going to operate this way and not operate that way is not going to change your heart, and it's not going to change the other person's heart. It's clear biblically that we do what we most want all the time. The way we function as humans is we always do what we most desire. Jesus talks about how a tree bears fruit according to its kind. That shows up in creation, right? When God creates things, he says they're going to bear fruit according and have seeds, and they're going to pass it on and grow according to their kind. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about the fact that, the kind of fruit you bear is based on the type of tree you are. What comes out of your mouth is what's in your heart. Mm-hmm. So boundaries can be helpful, but they're not going to solve all your problems. So I think that's important to acknowledge, that if you're having struggles in relationships, in friendships, in a dating relationship, in a marriage, whatever that might be, boundaries are going to be helpful, but they're not going to solve the heart level problems. That's something you need to wrestle through with God in conversation with other people. You need a change of heart initially. So I feel like we need to call that out specifically, that you can make all the rules, you can make all the boundaries you want, but if the heart issue is not dealt with, it's not going to be solved.
There has to be a posture, a right posture. And sometimes that right posture is just, like you said, starting with you and him before you extend it to others.
Yeah. And that's part of the taking responsibility for yourself, taking responsibility for your own heart. So step number one, if you want to be able to set boundaries, how do you set boundaries with your friends? Step number one, know the difference between a healthy boundary and an unhealthy boundary. We've talked about one part of that. Healthy boundaries identify, here's what I'm going to do. It takes responsibility for yourself. It's not about what the other person has to do.
I can give you an example.
Yes, so go for it.
6 of us, in my life group, we've been doing life together for the last 3 years. And there's times that we've caught each other saying something about someone in the group, and we did not bring it up to that person. And that, you know what that's called? That's called gossip. Yes, within guys, that happens still.
Even guys gossip.
Yeah, that's crazy, right? So when we heard this, there's this church that we really all watch and respect. And one of the things that they did was they made sure that gossip was in a safe place for their church and congregation. So one of the things they did was anytime you said something about someone, and the person would ask them, hey, did you tell them that? And then they would say, no. All right, you have 24 hours to go tell them, or I'll go tell them, right?
Yeah.
So we took that and we applied it to our group and say, all right, okay, anytime, Lucas said this and I was really annoyed by that, or Lucas did this. Well, did you talk to Lucas about that? Well, no. Well, Jimmy would say, all right, you have 24 hours to go tell Lucas, or I'll tell him, and we just apply that, and it's not a safe place for us to kind of talk bad about it. It's not talking bad. It's sometimes we just want to get things out.
Yeah.
And it's so funny how even I'm trying to justify it. We just want to get things out. No, gossip is gossip,
Yeah.
So the rule for us was like, hey, a healthy boundary was anytime we talked bad about each other or said something about each other and the other person did not know, what we would do is like, hey, you have 24 hours to tell that person. Yeah. Or if you I'll let you tell them. If you don't, then I'll tell them.
Yeah. So I'll point out a couple things in there that I think are positive things about that boundary. One, it's specific, right? You said, hey, this is the period of time, and if this does not happen in that period of time, then here's what I'm going to do. And you're saying what would be great is for you. I would love you to go tell them, but right, the reality is in that scenario, you can't force the other person to go talk to that person. So what in that boundary you're saying, if that doesn't happen in this amount of time, here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. And why? Some people are listening to this. That sounds a little bit harsh,
Yeah.
But why do I want to do that? Or why do we set that up? It's like, well, we all want to look more like Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Like, man, sin destroys things. And not that, oh, Lucas is more holy. No. It's like, now, we are in each other's life, and we see something about each other that, wow, Lucas, I see this in you. Oh, wow, Jimmy, I see this in you. And Lucas, this is what you want, but this, what he says about this, like, we're all looking to Jesus. So whatever that is not honor him, we're going to try to remove it, and we're going to call it out, and we're going to call up each other towards Jesus. So like anything we said, like we're pointing to that, not for another group to notice us. We're more holy. No, that's not it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's a key thing there too. So I'll just run down these like bullet point format thing. The first fundamental thing, which is what you were just saying, for a healthy boundary is it's motivated by a love for the other person, a love for God, and a desire for their good. An unhealthy boundary, by contrast, is motivated by fear or anger or selfishness. The motive matters when it comes to boundaries. The second piece, like we said, is it's focused on what you're going to do. A healthy boundary says, here's my boundary, here's what I'm going to do. An unhealthy boundary says, you have to do this. That's unhealthy. And then I'd say a third thing we need to be really clear on is a healthy boundary is consistent so that other people know what to expect. Right? It'd be an unhealthy boundary in your group if that boundary was applied to like 2 people in the group and the other 4 people were kind of in cahoots saying, yeah, we're going to make them not do that. And then we're going to still gossip and not apply those rules to ourselves. The fourth thing I'd say, I think healthy boundaries, there's flexibility and graciousness built into them. They're not rigid.
Yeah.
An unhealthy boundary is rigid and harsh. Henry Cloud in the book Boundaries, I think he used the metaphor of a gate versus a wall. A healthy boundary is like a gate that has, or is a fence that has a gate in it, where there's times where you're going to open that gate and let people in. There's times where that gate needs to stay closed. A wall, by contrast, doesn't let anything in or out. And I thought that was a helpful, like, kind of visual metaphor for here's a healthy boundary is going to be like a gate. There's time, right? A gate clearly says, here's my property, or a fence says, this is my property. That's your property. This is my yard. That's your yard. I'm not going to mow your yard. You're not going to mow my yard. But continuing with the metaphor of a yard, maybe sometimes your neighbor is gone and they say, hey, will you mow my yard for me while I'm gone on vacation? And you, as a good neighbor, are going to say, sure, I'll go through the gate and I'll mow your yard. But it would be an unhealthy thing if your neighbor was always saying, you need to mow my yard.
There's something about, like, there's a season that boundary is going to serve you, right?
Yeah.
There's a season, and, like, people are going to test that boundary too.
Yeah.
You know, you had an example about a friend that would babysit for a mom, and she would reach out, not even a 24-hour notice, like, hey, can you do this for me? And then, you know, the friend would communicate, hey, I need 24 hours.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to babysit your kid, but you have to tell me in 24 hours.
Yeah.
And then the mom kept doing that. And then her friend was like, all right. It happened again. She's like, I told you I needed 24 hours.
Yep.
I can't.
Yeah.
So, and people are going to get upset. People are going to test it. Family, I think, is the one that's the hardest. Testing your boundaries.
Yeah.
So
maybe I'll give one more example contrasting a healthy versus unhealthy boundary. Let's say you talked in our last episode about trying to take a day of rest each week, the biblical idea of Sabbath. A healthy way to set that boundary is to say, I'm taking this day of rest. I'm not going to be available to respond to, emails, text messages, whatever. Maybe you're communicating this at work. You're saying, hey, boss, in the past, I may have responded to emails on Saturdays, but I'm doing this now, so I'm not going to respond. An unhealthy way to frame that boundary would be to say, you guys need to stop emailing me or calling me on that day. Now, if the other person is respectful, they should pick up on the fact, but your boundary needs to be about, here's what I'm going to do. You can say, I'm not going to respond, or I'm going to have my phone off, or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So that's number one. I think if you want to be able to, how do you set boundaries with your friends? You first need to understand healthy versus unhealthy boundaries. Yep. Number two is the actual step of defining what are the boundaries that I need to have set. And in order to do that, I think you need to have a couple things in place. First, you need to know who you are in the sense of, I need to know what's my responsibility, what's not. And as followers of Jesus, we need to say, what does the Bible say are boundaries that I should have in place? And then kind of the next layer in that, I would say, is you need to know, what do you as a unique person value? Like, what are your wirings? What are your strengths? What are your abilities? Like, for me, I'm much more extroverted. So I have, I'm trying to think of the best way to say, I have fewer social boundaries than some people I know who are introverted. Like, for me, if I was making choices for my own life, I'd say my house is just wide open. Anyone can come over whenever, like, because I love people. I'm happy to be interrupted by people. Other people, that would be like a terrible and terrifying thing for them, to have an open house or an open space like that. So you need to understand who you are, who God says you are, and like how God has uniquely wired you in order to set those boundaries well.
Remember the thing about boundaries too, and why it looks so different, because God created us all different.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. There's something that I know for me, and I know for my girlfriend. She likes to go on walks, and she likes to. Nature is her thing, right?
Yeah.
For me, is give me a book, give me a coffee, and I'm gonna just sit and do nothing. Like, that fills me, right?
Yeah.
So it's gonna there's a what fills you, and what I mean, and you have to be careful with that though too, because that can be,
and that goes back to the boundary shouldn't be motivated by selfishness.
Exactly, right? But my posture is like, no, like, it gives me the capacity to love that person. It gives me the capacity to serve this person. It gives me the capacity to do good work for the rest of the week for the Lord, So, like, that's why I rest. And that boundary set, because I know I'm working from that, not for that, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, that's why I said it, you know? So but again, there's a part of, I know I have to do that and it still serves me, but my posture is not that, that doesn't define me or that's not my thing, you know? So
is there anything that you would say like across the board for someone who's a Christian follower of Jesus? This should be something they need to take into account when they're setting boundaries.
I think this is really, really simple. Does it honor you or does it honor him? And okay, now break that down. Okay, what is it?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Don't use this Christian language with me. Like, what does that really mean? Okay, does it line up to what he says and what he says about you?
Yeah.
Or are you doing it because someone else is doing it?
Sure. Yeah.
Or because you've seen someone else do it? I think a lot of, especially this generation, like pastoral care has become a really cool thing. Everyone wants to get into ministry. I see a lot of people kind of getting into ministry though around us right now, and it's like really, really cool, you know. And like, okay, why are you doing that? Are you doing it so you can get noticed? Like, are you doing it? If you set a boundary, I get up at 5 a.m. every morning to go work out. That's and I'm telling everyone that I do that.
Yeah.
It's like, I be careful. Do not set boundaries because someone else is doing it.
Yeah. Or for like the approval of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to have the right posture of doing it.
Yeah.
And what that looks like is, man, if there's unease there or there's something there, sometimes it will be unease in the beginning to do something that you've never done before or like, I don't like conflict, but I know that I kind of sometimes have to go through conflict. You know, I can't run away from conflict. So I'm going all over the place. Don't set boundaries based off other people's opinions, what other people think. Yeah. Whatever you do it because he said so, not because someone else said it.
Yeah, there's a couple things in Scripture I think that we can say pretty definitively. This isn't an exhaustive list, but one is that people matter more than stuff. You know, people matter more than getting things done, or people matter more than pay or whatever. So when you're taking boundaries into account, if you're a follower of Jesus, you need to say, man, do my boundaries, are they loving towards people? Or are they more about helping me get stuff done or helping me? Not that you shouldn't get stuff done. Obviously, biblically, we're called, we have purpose. Another one I would say is that you need to have boundaries around that leave space and make space for time with God, time in the Word and time in prayer. Those are things that every Christian should make space for. And then the third one, I think it would be rest. Biblically, you're called. Sabbath is a huge priority throughout the Old Testament. Creation is built on a rhythm of rest and work. That should be built into how you're functioning.
We should talk about that in an episode.
Yeah.
I feel like
the rhythms of rest. You know, it's as you're kind of defining those boundaries for you, your friends, people around you. One, pray about it as you're evaluating those things. Two, do that in conversation with other people. Like have a conversation where you are sitting down with people who are peers and people who are older and wiser than you, and talking with them and saying, what are my boundaries? What should they be?
Yeah. Sometimes it does feel like you're selfish when you set a boundary.
Yeah.
And because you probably are used to setting boundaries from a pride perspective.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people, we come from that. Like, and then they start setting healthy boundaries that do honor the Lord, boundaries that like, hey, like I prayed about this, I talked to someone about it. Like, and I would say sometimes the enemy uses that. Sometimes the enemy uses your past to, even when you try to do things do it in a way that honors the Lord or the way that He would do it. The enemy will use the enemy will say, "Oh, you're just doing that so you feed yourself more, or you're just doing that because you're just selfish." Like, yeah, I would. There's a spiritual warfare on that too, you know. So,
and that's where it's helpful to have a conversation with someone else, because someone else is going to be able to point out, actually, that does seem selfish. That's actually the Holy Spirit convicting you of that. Or actually, it's not. Like, that's a totally solid thing to have that boundary there.
Yeah. So what we're saying is, if you're setting boundaries, invite people into it.
Yeah, invite people into that process.
Step into it. There's some clear ones that we all know. There's some okay, we're not going to have sex before marriage.
Yeah, biblically, that's pretty definitive.
There's clear ones, right? But there's nuances. There's so many different. All of our lives look different. All of our relationships look different, and how you work and how I work is so different though too. God created you in a different way that he wired us in different ways though too. What I enjoy, what you enjoy might be different, or it might be the same, but even in that the sameness there's something about different, you know. So
and once you've done that work of kind of defining what those boundaries are, it may even be helpful to like sit down and write those out for yourself so that you know what you're wanting to aim towards. The next thing you need to do is you got to communicate those, because one of the things I see over and over again, I see this in myself, I see this in workplace scenarios. People get frustrated when someone else is crossing the boundaries that they have, the expectations that they've set. But man, if you have not communicated that thing verbally, you don't have a right to get angry about it. Like if you're getting annoyed at your roommate for not picking up their, maybe they leave their shoes right in the middle of the walkway when they come in, and you're getting annoyed about that, and you have never said, hey, can we please keep these on the side? You don't have a right to get annoyed about that. Just because it's your expectation does not mean that is the way the world works. Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing is if you're setting boundaries, you got to communicate it verbally.
Yeah. Don't text them.
Yeah. Right.
Sit them down and say, all right, I want to talk to you about something. And here's why I want to talk to you about this. And here's what this looks like. And just be as clear as possible. And don't overcomplicate it with your words too. Yes, yeah. And even if it sounds a little bit like rough or selfish, or if you've done the work, it might sound a little bit selfish too. If you're talking to someone that change, when someone that you love is changing and someone that you have known for a long time is changing, it's like for someone else, that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah.
So as you do it, just be compassionate and be direct too at the same time. And be bold, and then here's what's going to happen next. I think there's that flow of, here's how I want to talk to you. Here's what I want to do. Here's what's going to happen next.
Yes. Yeah. That's important.
Yeah.
And I mean, the other piece of this, man, expect to need to reiterate that communication regularly. This is not going to be, if you're a friend, if it's a spouse, a significant other, whatever, expect to have to communicate that multiple times. Not because the other person's a jerk, not because they don't care about you, but just purely because it's not something that's on their radar all the time. So just, have that expectation. You're probably gonna have to tell someone 4, 5, 6 times. Yeah. And that doesn't, just because they're forgetting about the boundary does not mean they dislike you or they don't care about you.
Yeah. People are going to test your boundaries. And hate to say this, but that's normal.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen to you, well, you're a lucky duck. That's all I got to tell you.
I mean, I'll give a good example of this. I've got 4 kids. I mentioned this before. One of the things that I do consistently, I get up early, I exercise, and then I have some time for prayer and reading the Word. My kids have always gotten up early, especially our boys. And for a lot of years, I was frustrated about the fact that I was getting interrupted early in those mornings. I didn't have that alone time. That was a boundary I would love to have. And I came to realize over time that as they've gotten older, they've gotten better. They now kind of just know that's what Dad does. If we're awake and Dad's reading his Bible, we should play quietly. But they consistently, even just yesterday morning, my oldest son was bugging me about looking at Legos online and wanting to have my phone and look at Legos. In that moment, I could get angry at him and say, man, I'm doing this when I'm sitting in this chair reading my Bible, that I'm doing this. I can get angry at him. But that's not helpful, and that's not gracious towards him. Instead, just realize, man, he's a human. He's got desires, and I just can gently remind him, hey, this is the boundary I've set. This time is for that. After I'm done with this, I will help you with that thing. And we need to be able to have that kind of graciousness. Not, and by no means am I perfect at that. There's been plenty of mornings where I'm like, dude, what the heck? Like, you know this. This has been every morning of your life that you've been alive. But we need to be able to be gracious as we communicate that stuff repeatedly. Because last thing I think you need to do after you communicate your boundaries, you need to guard those boundaries. If you don't stand by the commitments that you've made, what you've said you're going to do, it's pointless. And that goes back to where we mentioned, setting boundaries doesn't change your heart. Mm-hmm. You need the work of heart change, and that heart change is necessary in order for you to follow through on that.
And I'll come to a season again. Just want to clear this up too. Like, it'll come to a season that boundary is not needed anymore.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
And don't hold too tight.
Mm-hmm.
Guarding it's important, but don't hold too tight. And maybe it's not going to serve you in that one season of your life.
And that goes back to the walls versus fence metaphor that Henry Cloud talks about, right? There's going to be, going back to my story of dealing with kids in the morning when I'm trying to do my Bible time. There's times where it's appropriate, mornings where it's probably appropriate for me to say, you know what? I'm actually going to set my Bible aside and I'm going to take this 20 minutes and connect with my son because it's not just about me getting what I want. Other people have needs as well. Mm-hmm. And that's important to be able to do that, where you don't want those boundaries to be rigid. I mean, let's do this. Let's think about a couple examples of what's an honoring way to guard your boundaries. Because like you said earlier, it kind of feels like you're being a jerk if you're used to operating one way with someone and then you set a boundary with that friend or that significant other or whatever, and then have to kind of like enforce that. It doesn't feel very nice. Let's say, let's do this example. Let's say someone has a parent who is consistently calling them to complain about the way their other parent is operating. And so they've set the boundary. They've said, mom or dad, let's say it's mom. Mom, I feel like it's gossip for me to listen to you talking bad about dad. That's not how I want to operate. So I don't want you to, please don't gossip to me about dad. If that happens, I'm going to end the conversation. What's a helpful, gracious way to guard that boundary? Let's say it's your mom. Your mom calls you and is talking bad about your dad. Mm-hmm. How do you graciously guard that boundary?
I was going to crack a joke. I was going to say, just hang up right away.
That's probably an example of how to not be gracious, especially if it's the first time after you set that boundary.
If it's the first time, just remind them, all right, here's what we talked about. And I think always starting with okay, this is hard for me to say again. Here's what we talked about. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Or do you, is there something that I missed? Because if there is, I want to clear that up right now. Mm-hmm. And after that, okay, here's what's going to happen now. I don't want to continue this conversation. Either we change the subject or this conversation's done. If that's the only thing you wanted to talk about, this conversation's done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds mean though. That sounds,
it does.
But starting with, I don't want to do this. I don't want to say this again. But I'm going to.
Or reiterating the why behind here's why I'm going to do this. I think is also a valuable thing.
Maybe ending it with that of here's what's going to happen next, and here's why I'm doing it.
Or even the acknowledging your discomfort doing it. Because I think a valuable. Say, hey mom, this feels really mean for me to do this, but I said this yesterday or whatever it was, and I want to stand by what I've said. Happy to talk with you about something else, but.
Yeah. And then if they do it again, I would say that's when you have to be a little bit more of just pretty straightforward, and maybe that's sometimes loving someone. It's not going to look easy. It's not going to be sunshine and rainbows, and loving someone saying, all right, we've had this conversation before. This stops here. I'm hanging up.
Yeah.
And how is that kind though? How is that nice? How is that?
Yeah. It doesn't feel nice. That's for sure.
It doesn't. But I think those are, sometimes you have to be kind of that radical, but you also have to, don't do it if you're angry, don't do that. Mm-hmm. But you will be angry when people test out your values though too. And you have to be careful of just slow down in those moments And it's like, hey, I don't want to respond any other way. I'm really upset right now. I'm gonna hang up.
Why don't we let's do one final example with this, because I think it's helpful to get a variety of dynamics here. How about you have a friend who is consistently asking for money. End of the month, they're coming to you, and this has been a pattern. They said, "Man, hey, can you, like, I'm short on rent at my apartment. Can you give me $100?" Or, "Hey, all your friends are going out to eat," and they're like, "Oh man, I can't. Sorry." Like, they come out, they're at dinner, and then at the end of the dinner, they're like, "You know what? I actually can't pay for my meal. Could one of you guys pay for my meal?" And it's like not a one-time thing. It's been a pattern for a while, and you've set a boundary with them, had a conversation, communicated with them. Hey, man, like, I love you, but I don't feel like it's right for me to be consistently paying for your meals, paying for your stuff. I feel like you need to be responsible with your finances. So you've set a boundary saying, I'm not going to pay for your stuff anymore. Happens again. They come to you and say, "Man, I'm short $200 on rent this month. Can you spot me the money?"
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that graciously?
I have had someone that was close to me that they were kind of going through that, and the way I kind of handled that. I mean, that's you help when you can, because people have helped me for sure.
Yes.
You know, so but you continually helping that person is not loving sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So one, you have to understand when that threshold is for that person, because it looks different.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, so if I give you this money, is that loving? Probably not if it's 5 times.
Yeah.
Or 4 times.
Yeah. If it's become an ongoing,
I don't think that's loving. I mean, the loving thing to do is, hey, next time I'm going to give you this time, but I'm also going to let you know next time you ask me, I can't give you anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want me to help you figure this out?
Yeah.
How can I help you budget? How can I help you
Totally.
do something? Maybe that's it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. If you've already set the boundary, maybe you need to say, "No, I'm not going to give you this money because we talked about this. But what I can do for you is, hey, let's sit down and I will help you figure out how you're going to make that money before rent is due. Or I'll help you call, if you feel uncomfortable talking to your apartment manager, I'll help you get in touch with them, see if you can get an extension on your rent so you can live to your next paycheck or whatever."
And sometimes, though, I've had to come to this point of just like, hey, with some people, it's like I heard this from, I think one of my friends told me he did it this way, so I started doing it too. Because it was loving. I saw how loving it was. Anytime a family member or anyone asked him for money, I was like, hey, yes, I'm going to give you this, but you can never ask me for money again.
Mm. Yeah.
It's like, and you don't have to pay me back.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you this. I don't want you to pay me back, but you can never ask me for money again.
That's a clear boundary.
He's really, like, he was really stern, like, okay, this is how I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And he said, like, that dynamic of someone owing him money and things like that, it's like he's felt like that. He's like, I don't want that for someone, you know? So, yeah. Sometimes it has to be that clear. And I kind of started applying that in my life, though, too. It's like, yeah, you can. But you can never ask me for money again. I mean, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So here's, I think, a key thing, right? We'll go back to the start of what we were saying, man. Biblical boundaries are going to be motivated by love. And biblical love is about doing what is the most ultimate good for that other person. So for this example that we're talking about here of the friend who's consistently asking for money, short term, it's nice for them for you to solve their problem by giving them the money. The most ultimate good, though, is to help them grow and mature and get equipped to be able to handle their own finances, rather than you solving their problem repeatedly.
Yeah. And like, I can kind of relate to that in a way of like, man, starting your own businesses, there's years that you don't make anything.
Yeah.
And you need help. And people have helped me, like my family, you know, but it was a point of like, you got to figure this thing out, you know, and that was such a loving thing. And it's just like, oh, like they're not going to help me next month, or they're not going to, it's like, but I had to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I figured it out. And then like if they just continue to keep helping me, then there would have been like no urgency a little bit behind it.
Yeah.
Even if I was working a lot, even when we were trying to figure it out, that's what's like. But there was this drive. There was just something different about like, man, like
when you know someone else is not going to solve your problem, you're a little bit more motivated to figure it out yourself.
Yeah. So I relate to that person that's kind of, if you're someone that's like struggling financially or struggling with, like, I empathize with that because I've seen it from me though too. Of like, wow,
for sure.
I know what it's not to ask someone's help, but maybe that friend that you're going to or that someone that you're going to and asking for money. I mean, you have to, I know this is kind of changing to a different subject here, but you're going to need to really, you need to sit down and really, it's like, okay, is there things that I'm doing that's causing this too?
Yeah. Which I think that goes back to boundaries being about taking responsibility first for yourself.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking to someone else to solve your problems consistently, that's a sign that you have a boundary problem. So should you set boundaries with your friends? Like we talked about last episode? Yes, definitely. That may be you setting those internally, but there's probably going to be seasons in any relationship where you need to sit down and communicate with someone and say, hey, this is the boundary. Here's what I'm going to do if we cross that boundary. And that's going to be an important, valuable thing. And ultimately, right, if love is the motive, it's going to be better for you and for them and for your relationship to have integrity, to stand by those boundaries, to take responsibility for yourself and to enable them, empower them to take responsibility for themselves. And obviously, right, as Christians, we say grace is a huge part of that. And that goes back to the quote I read at the start of this episode with Henry Cloud talking about Galatians 6:2-5. We are responsible. I'll just read the start of it again. He says, we are responsible to others and for ourselves. We're responsible to help others carry their loads, but we're not responsible for their loads. And I think that's a helpful distinction.
Hey friend, thanks for listening. We're all about equipping you to pursue real friendships. You were not created to be alone because life is just better with real friends. Let's get started.